welcome. My name is Andrew Gerhart, and I'm the VP of Publisher Platforms for InMobi. I'm really excited to be here with all of you, and I'd like to say thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I just wanted to cover some logistics. We've reserved time at the end of the webinar for questions. Please use the questions window to type out your questions, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. This webinar will be approximately 40 minutes. We understand that your time is valuable, and sometimes things come up. If for any reason you need to leave a little bit early, rest assured that we'll send the recording of this webinar to everyone who registered. For the best experience, we recommend using headphones and keeping the volume up high enough to hear us. In the event you need help with audio, please use the chat window. Now, let's get to the good stuff. As you may have heard, in January of this year, InMobi acquired Airserve to create the world's most powerful mobile video advertising and monetization platform. InMobi is the world's largest independent mobile advertising platform that specializes in delivering the best ROI for mobile marketers. A mobile-first and mobile-only platform, InMobi has been pioneering the next generation of video ad experiences, deep learning-based optimization algorithms, and header bidding to deliver maximum value to advertisers, users, and publishers. Today, we're excited to share the first of many webinars to help publishers better understand and navigate the mobile app monetization landscape. Our webinar today on the Essential Mediation Toolkit will be focused on the best practices for mobile ad mediation. We'll also help you understand the challenges with the traditional mediation waterfalls and get to the bottom of the differences between header bidding and a truly unified auction. Our goal is to leave you feeling well equipped to maximize revenue and yield from your mobile monetization strategy. So without further ado, let's jump in. As I mentioned, my name is Andrew Gerhart. My current role is the VP of Publisher Platforms with InMobi. I was the co-founder of Airserve, which was acquired by InMobi in January of this year. Today, we're going to talk about a few different topics. I'd like to start with some goals. Whenever I start a project, I like to look at what the goal is and keep that in mind as we navigate through. We're going to look at how things have changed over the years and how it influences today's technology and your monetization strategy. We'll talk a little bit about header bidding because it's such a hot topic in the industry. We'll talk about unified auctions, and we'll leave you with some great best practices and tips that you can take to make more money with your ad monetization. So let's jump in. Let's talk about goals. At a high level, with our monetization strategy, our goal is to make as much money as possible. But we have a qualifier here that we want to annoy as few users as possible. What does that mean? That means we want to maximize our average revenue per daily active user, the amount of money we're generating from each user, but we simultaneously want to be maximizing the lifetime value of those users. So we want to keep an eye on our user retention and make sure that we're not bringing in users that we're aggravating and they're leaving too soon. We don't want to be having poor reviews in the App Store. The third goal is that we want to spend the least amount of time as possible worrying about ad monetization. We have businesses to run. We can be out there acquiring new users. We could be optimizing our content, building our businesses. We shouldn't be worrying about the tedious aspects of ad monetization. So those are the three goals. Let's keep those in mind as we continue the conversation. I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about how mediation and how ad monetization has changed over the years. A lot is different since AdMob first started back in 2006, and a lot has changed in the industry. So if you think about it, back in 2006, 2007, the App Store market was really still forming. There was lots of different apps that would come and go, come into the top 10, top 20. That was when Uber, it's crazy to think about now, but that's when Uber was just starting. And so they were spending millions on user acquisition, Machine Zone, all these different companies were really driving mobile ad spend. Now what we see is that the App Store charts are largely dominated by large players. Similarly, back in those days, the ad tech market was still forming. There was many new companies coming into play. The legacy players that legacy exchanges and SSPs were primarily still focused on desktop and maybe a little bit of mobile web. But now what we see is that the market is far more mature. There's been an explosion of programmatic ad spend, and that has all resulted in consolidation of ad tech. Another large trend that publishers need to be aware of is that, back in those days, mobile ad spend really was dominated by performance buyers. And this is, still continues today. It's true, there's still many performance buyers, but what we see today is a large amount of ad spend now going towards brands, which is great for publishers, but they need to be aware of how those brands spend in a mobile app environment. Which leads to the next point. In the past, publishers may have their inventory purchased in large quantities in mass at fixed rates. So a buyer may come to you and say, I'd like to purchase 1 million of your impressions at a fixed rate of $6 CPM, something like that. As programmatic ad spend has increased and as programmatic ad buying has increased, the way that buyers transact in media is now on an individual user basis. So instead of pre-purchasing hundreds of thousands or millions of impressions, now they want to find individual users. And so the way that they're buying inventory from publishers and across the landscape has changed dramatically as programmatic has changed. And so that's something to keep in mind as we think about how we're going to monetize our inventory, and we'll talk about that in detail in just a moment. And the last point is that the formats really have changed. And so back in those days, it was banners, static interstitials, but as the market has matured and evolved, and as the technology has improved, we've seen an extreme rise in engaging formats like video, playable ads, and other highly engaging formats that are not only good for the user, but good for advertisers and good for publishers. So a lot has changed over the past couple of years. That has presented some good opportunities, but also some challenges with today's technology. And so many publishers are still using waterfall-based systems. Maybe they're using Google DFP, maybe they're using MoPub, maybe they've built their own technology in-house, a waterfall-based system to be able to switch between SDKs. Largely those systems are waterfall, meaning that it goes from I hit one ad provider, and if they don't return the ad or don't fill the ad, it goes to the next one in the waterfall based on prioritization or CPM. The challenge is waterfalls really aren't built for programmatic. They're built when I know the price of the inventory, I know the price of the demand that's there, and I know how much they want to buy. And so it makes it easy for me to determine how to prioritize my demand. I can put a $10 tag to add a $6 tag to and then a $4. Very easy to prioritize. And I go down the waterfall. The challenge is with programmatic buyers lowering the waterfall, but have no opportunity to see inventory, and oftentimes that's the most valuable inventory. It gets hidden from those buyers, and so it's a big challenge for these programmatic buyers. Another challenge is that in many cases, it's self-fulfilling, meaning that if I have multiple buyers in my waterfall, and oftentimes publishers can be working with 5 to 10 different buyers and at multiple price points, the publishers lower in the waterfall are not able to see the inventory, and they perform worse. And so because they're lower in the waterfall, they never get a chance to make it to the top. And so that's another challenge that publishers will see. Another challenge with today's technology is that it really, because it wasn't built for programmatic, most of the technologies today cannot consume programmatic demand, meaning it's built for a static price of $6 or $5. But when a programmatic buyer wants to submit a bid of $6.25 or $4.36 or $10.39, it can't consume that. And so the challenge is publishers aren't able to capture that great demand, and it leads to inaccuracies in the reporting. A big thing, and if we look back to our goals, I want to make as much money as possible, but I also want to spend the least amount of time as possible, right? I want my business to be efficient. I want my operations to be efficient. Waterfalls are really difficult and tedious to manage. As my business scales, the number of buyers that I need to work with scales. Instead of working with 1 or 2 buyers, now I may need to work with 10 or 15. And within those buyers, I may have different different prices that I work with. So instead of it just being 15 lines, maybe it's 30, maybe it's 40. And so if I have multiple apps, if I have multiple ad units, you can see how this starts to compound and it becomes very, very difficult and time consuming to manage. And so these historical waterfall systems are quite tedious. A big challenge is that they're slow. And within desktop environments, when the user's at a PC, maybe this was okay. But as we all know, in the mobile environment, when the user's on the go and maybe they don't have the best connection, latency is absolutely critical. And the challenge is with a waterfall-based system, each hop in the waterfall adds to the user experience and the impact on the user experience. And so as I traverse down the waterfall, if the buyers are not filling the ads or serving the ads, then the SDK has to go back to the ad server, has to retrieve an ad line, attempt to serve an ad, and each of those hops is at best 400 milliseconds and maybe even a second. So you can see that if I'm working with 5, 10, 15 different networks or ad lines, things can start to add up and get quite slow. And so these waterfall systems have a big impact on latency and a big impact on leakage. Another big challenge is the issue of transparency. And so when we talk to publishers in the market, we often hear, I'd really love more transparency from my provider. And that can mean a number of things. It can mean that they're not getting insight into who's buying their inventory, the particular DSPs, the particular brands. Is it Coca-Cola? Is it Chevrolet? Who's serving the ad? They may want to know the exact pricing. They may have seen a bad ad, something that they thought they had blocked, and they don't know who's serving it. And so all around, publishers just need more insight into what's happening within their auction. And so at InMobi, we put a great emphasis on transparency, bringing unique data points and insights about the publisher's monetization to them in the platform, which allows you to optimize your ad stack. Without metrics, you can't optimize. You're running blind. And so it really is the lifeblood of your ad monetization. So we looked at how the market's changed. We've talked about how the technology really hasn't caught up with it. The technology really hasn't evolved as the market's evolved. One of the pieces of technology that has risen to popularity in the past couple of years is header bidding. I'm sure you've all heard about it. There's been countless articles about header bidding. So let's talk about what that is. Header bidding is really an advanced, I would say, programmatic tool for publishers to bring in programmatic yield. The way it works is that header bidding allows a publisher to call multiple ad exchanges or programmatic partners simultaneously before making the call to their ad server. And so in a desktop environment, they have a header bidding container that sits on the page instead of being called from within the ad server. Within that container, there'll be a call to multiple SSPs or exchanges or DSPs. And so they can pull back bids from those buyers. And then the results or the winning bid from that auction is then pushed into the ad server. And so as this diagram suggests, based on the result of the header bidding auction, it is then injected into the header bidding slot of the waterfall, right? And so I would have to predetermine some slots in the waterfall, and then it's injected into that slot. So it sounds pretty good, right? And some of the pros with header bidding are that publishers can capture incremental yield. I can call out to these programmatic partners, and if they have high CPM demand, I'm able to capture that. And previously, I may not have been able to. If that programmatic partner was previously somewhere in my waterfall, maybe they're number 2, maybe they're number 10, they may not have been called for that particular ad impression in the past. And so with header bidding, I'm now able to present them with the inventory, and I'm now able to consume their dynamic bid and push it into my waterfall and serve the impression. And so One of the pros of header bidding is that I can bring in more yield from these programmatic partners. A big thing is that it allows publishers to minimize latency. So instead of having maybe 3 or 4 programmatic partners or exchanges or DSPs in my waterfall, I can take all of them out of the waterfall, put them in my header bidding container, and now I'm calling them simultaneously. So I've minimized calls from my waterfall and I've minimized some latency, which is great. And third, I'm minimizing some leakage within the waterfall. And so I mentioned that earlier, but when we talk to publishers and through some of the testing that we've run, we've seen anywhere from a 10% to even greater drop off in impressions through waterfalls. So every time it goes from ad network 1 to ad network 2 within the waterfall, there is a real and significant leakage of impressions. And that's due to passback tags, that's due to going from the ad server to the SDK for a variety of reasons. And so using header bidding technology and the simultaneous ad calls, it allows you to eliminate that leakage and capture those impressions and revenue back. But there's always the flip side. So what is the flip side? There's a couple of cons. Well, the number one is that the winning bid from the header bidding is still passed into the waterfall, right? I still have a waterfall that I have to manage. I still have an ad call going into the waterfall, and then if something doesn't fill, it goes to the next ad line. And so I still have this two-pronged system between header bidding and a waterfall. The second thing that many publishers don't think about is there can often be offset timing with partners. If I'm using both waterfall and header bidding, that means that I have some partners that are being called on every ad call within the header bidding container or SDK. But there may also be programmatic partners within my waterfall. And it may be that it's an ad network you're working with and they've just launched their own exchange. And so there's now a programmatic component to that network. Maybe they're not fully programmatic. They're not an SSP or something like that, but they still have a programmatic piece of their business. The challenge is programmatic is very time-based. And so if I'm calling all of my programmatic partners from header bidding first, and then the network that also has the exchange only gets called maybe 600 milliseconds later once it gets them in the waterfall, I've given an unfair advantage to my other partners. And so there's some timing considerations that have to be taken into effect when you think about integrating header bidding into a waterfall and how that impacts all the partners within the chain. And the third is that now you have two systems, right? So now I have my header bidding partners. I likely have a header bidding SDK and platform. I also have my waterfall-based system. I'm managing things in two places. And so while there's absolute value to what header bidding can do, there's also some downsides to it and things to take into consideration. So the market has evolved and moved towards programmatic in a big, big way. A lot of the studies that we've seen show anywhere from 50 to 75% of ad spend moving towards programmatic, and that's across desktop, mobile web, in-app, connected TV, and all formats. It really is the way of the future, and it's where ad spend is going. And we've talked about how the technology really hasn't kept up with it, and that's why header bidding was created, to give publishers a way to capture more of the programmatic ad spend and pull it into their ad stack. And so if the existing technology today is okay and header bidding is a little bit better, well, what's the best? That's where InMobi's unified auction comes into play. So let's take a look at what a unified auction really is. A unified auction is a comprehensive, simultaneous auction across all ad sources. This means that I'm calling all of my buyers at the same time. I'm allowing them to compete for the inventory, and I'm consuming the dynamic bids from any buyer that can submit it. Why is this better? Well, for a few different reasons. Number one, I'm now able to capture the highest price, the maximum CPM, the maximum value for every single impression. I'm no longer working within two systems. I'm no longer only presenting certain inventory to certain buyers. Now I can capture the maximum yield. It allows all of my buyers to see my inventory. Whereas today, most publishers have to prioritize their ad sources, and they have to determine who sees what, and only a certain percentage of their buyers get to see the greatest percentage of their inventory. What happens in today's market is that one ad network will come in and soak up a lot of the inventory, and it leaves a lot of the other buyers without, they don't get to see the inventory, they don't get to submit their bid, and the publisher never gets to realize whether or not they're maximizing their return. A unified auction eliminates latency entirely. I no longer have a waterfall because I'm simultaneously calling out to all of my buyers, and so I no longer have any leakage or latency within the waterfall. As I just mentioned, it eliminates all the leakage, and so through our studies, we've seen anywhere from 10 to 15% drop off, and that's real revenue at scale. And so you can capture back that revenue that you may have lost through passback tags, through the hops from the ad server to the SDK, and from different ad network to ad network. You can capture all of that revenue back with the unified auction. And a big component is that it minimizes all that tedious work managing a waterfall and prioritizing ad networks. And when we go back to the goals, we think about, hey, I want to maximize my revenue. I want to maximize the lifetime value of my users and make sure that I am maximizing retention, but I also want to be efficient with my operations and minimize the work. And so unified auctions allow you to accomplish all of those goals. So let's take a look at some best practices on mediation and ad monetization in general. One of the things that we see many publishers driving significant revenue with is multiple price tier strategies. So instead of working with one price point for one buyer, or working with them and slotting them one point in the waterfall, many publishers will identify multiple price tiers for their programmatic buyers. I may work with a programmatic buyer and set up a price tier at $20 or $15 to capture premium demand. And again, this works best with a programmatic buyer. Then I may set up another price point at $10 or $8 to capture more fill rate. And then I may set up another one at a more higher fill rate line at a lower price point at the bottom. I can do this across multiple buyers to test different price points and see what's working best. So this is a very successful strategy used by many different publishers and buyers. Another important component is identifying differences with regional inventory and regional buyers. Markets are very different in terms of their maturity levels. The US market is very mature in terms of mobile video. It's now expanding into playable ads. Everybody has most people have strong connections. And so the market's quite mature in terms of price discovery and the strong buyers in the market and the ad units. But markets in South America or certain markets in Asia have definite differences in terms of the buyers that are available, the prices, and the ad units that are dominant. Some are stronger in native, some are stronger in video. It's really important that a publisher understands these differences and chooses a partner that can help them to navigate these differences. When we consult with publishers, we tell them that they can't, it's not recommended to set up one price point for a buyer across all these different geos. It's much better to set different price floors based on the market. It's also, you have to understand where you can and can't use a high impact format like video or a playable ad or M-rate. And so as we build out our monetization strategy and plan, we have to understand these regional differences. The second thing, we've seen a lot of publishers move towards server-to-server connections, implementing buyers that support a server-to-server based connection and are able to submit back a dynamic bid instead of using a flat price. This allows the publisher to capture the maximum amount of value and also allows them to reduce SDK bloat. So many programmatic buyers and many ad networks now can support server-to-server connections. For a publisher, this allows you to minimize the SDKs you have in your app, minimize your app bloat, minimize the work integrating those SDKs, and makes things far more efficient in terms of integrating buyers, testing them, optimizing your stack. It's far more efficient. One thing that we talk about with publishers is the goal for the optimization and for their monetization. And some people think that you can only optimize for premium pricing, or I can only optimize for maximum fill rate. What we found is that you can optimize for both. I can put together a monetization package or buyer composition that has both high pricing and both high fill rate. There's some buyers that are great for premium demand, and there's some buyers and some partners that are great for, we'll call, remnant demand and remnant inventory, where they have maybe a lower CPM but very, very high fill rate. And so publishers need to understand the market landscape and how they can optimize for both. The important part of a monetization strategy is the optimization with multi-ad units. And this ties back into the goal of efficiency, but also regional differences. If I'm working with native, if I have native ads in my app, maybe native is very strong in one particular geo, but quite weak in another. So I want to integrate a multi-ad unit where it can fail over or fail over to a banner ad. And maybe I want to implement video for the US market, but for another market where video is less mature, I can show a banner ad, or maybe I can show an interstitial ad. And so it's really important to have technology, and this is within the SDK and the ad server, the mediation platform, that can allow you to work with all of those different formats. I'm getting some messages on from the colleagues. I apologize if there was any audio issues. Hopefully you can hear me now. Another big thing is for publishers to understand the impacts, and we talked about this earlier about impression leakage in the waterfall, need to understand the impact of latency and errors. What we find within InMobi, we have detailed analytics around all of the buyers within the mediation platform. And we can see the average latency by buyer. And we can see how many of these buyers have SDK failures or buyer errors and how that's impacting our publishers. If they have 1 million ad calls and a buyer is failing the SDK 10% of the time, or if they have a latency issue and the users are timing out before they get to see the ad, that is a real world impact on the publisher's monetization and how much revenue they're generating. And without metrics, you're not able to shine a light on those buyers and not able to solve the issues. And so that's really where transparency comes into play. And those are some of the challenges that InMobi is trying to solve. Giving those metrics to publishers so that you can identify those issues and solve them with your buyers. This may be a no-brainer for some, but a big key part of monetization, working with different ad networks, is making sure you're ingesting the actual data using their third-party APIs and pulling in the real revenue and real impressions and real CPMs that they're generating every day. And that's really important to have accuracy in your reporting and making sure the auction is accurate. I don't want to have a buyer in at a $5 CPM when they're actually only serving at $2.75. So now they've soaked up a lot of impressions and somebody else lost the auction, but I served a lot of low-paying ads. So if I'm able to ingest in real time their CPM, their impressions, their revenue, now everything is more accurate, and I can make sure that I'm driving the maximum value from my users. That's all for our webinar. We have some great resources. We have some ebooks and whiteboard videos that we've put together about mediation, about monetization, our take on header bidding. And so we'll send these out after the webinar. Thank you very much for spending the time with us. I think we'd like to take a few questions from the audience if there are any. So I'll hand this over to Rajesh and see if we have any questions.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, for that sweet session on the essential mediation toolkit, and we have already have a few questions pouring in. So the first question out there is with regards to the transparency piece that you talked about. So the question here is, does this mean that the publisher can now actually see which advertiser is bidding on the publisher's slot on your mediation platform?
Yeah, so it depends on the mediation. I think the question was within the InMobi mediation platform. Yes, that's what we're working towards. Today, the transparency is we have full insights into which ad sources. And so let's say you're working with 3 different SSPs and 4 different ad networks. You're able to see all the auction metrics to see who is buying what impression, at what CPM, and you can understand why people are serving and why they're not. Maybe somebody won the auction, but they didn't serve because their SDK crashed or because it timed out and then it had to go to the next person in the auction. All those metrics are in the platform, which are really great and powerful for publishers to be able to monetize with their buyers. The next evolution of this is being able to see the DSPs underneath, and that's something that InMobi's working on. We're always working on ways to advance the transparency for our publishers and give them full insights into what's happening with their stack.
Great. Look forward to that. So the other question is basically, does adding more partners increase latency in your in my app? That's the basic question.
So it depends. It can. If you're using a waterfall-based technology, then yes, it absolutely can. Because if buyers are not filling, and this tends to happen in different levels at different times of the year. And so, for example, in December, that's typically a really strong time of the year where most buyers will be filling, they'll have high fill rates. And so your latency may be less in December. But in January, which is a really slow time of the year, or maybe in the summer when it's also a slow time of the year, fill rates may be lower and the buyers may be filling less. And so there's going to be more hops in my waterfall. And so there'll be more inherent latency and a poor user experience. With a unified auction, when we talked about the simultaneous ad calls that InMobi has, no, there's no latency because all the buyers are presented the inventory at the same time. All the calls go out at the same time. And then we determine who to serve an ad based on CPM and the algorithm. And so with InMobi, there's no latency.
Thank you. Thank you. So the next question, however, is very pointed towards mediation. So will adding mediation partners increase the size of my app?
It depends on the partners that you add. And so that's why we talk a lot about adding server-to-server connections. Now, not every buyer offers a server-to-server connection. There's some buyers out there like a Facebook audience network or potentially a Google where they do require the SDK, or maybe an App11 where they require the SDK. And so yes, I mean, adding those ad network SDKs will increase the size of your app as you add them. But that's just the world that we live in. Now, what we can do is try to combat that by balancing it with other buyers who are programmatic in nature and maybe don't need their SDK. And so it's more of a balancing act.
Okay, got it. We have another question that's just come in. So the gentleman would like to know if we could list the display ad networks that can be delivered via InMobi mediation, along with information if they are supporting real-time CPM.
Sure, we have all that information. Rajesh, if we could collect that gentleman's email address or that person's email address, then we could certainly send him a link to that information afterwards. We absolutely have that readily available.
Sure. I'll do that bit. And one last question on this is, can we control our waterfall or auction on the mediation platform?
Yeah, so we have built, as we built out the unified auction, we didn't do it in a vacuum. We talked to customers and talked to publishers and understand the market and realize that publishers still want some level of control, right? They want to be able to move things around, and they also want to be able to execute premium deals. So maybe they work with a buyer or an ad network and offer them, some exclusive on X number of impressions at a premium CPM. That requires you to be able to prioritize that deal. And so what we've built in is a prioritization mechanism within the unified auction. And so within our system, within our mediation platform, every buyer is still called simultaneously, but you're able to pin an ad source or multiple ad sources at the top. And so if they return an ad, they would get right of first refusal. And so they would serve before anyone else, even if they don't pay the most. And so we've built in a prioritization mechanism in addition or on top of the unified auction.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, for answering all those questions. Uh, and thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot, guys, for joining and listening in on this InMobi webinar. Until the next time, it's bye bye from our side. See you next time.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.